This is a 6-part series of the same story, of which you are listening to part 6 of 6. Let's get started.
So, from here, I am sure you can guess where this last piece goes. If you haven't been reading comments, I don't blame you because I write a ton. However, these are the little details that dragged me down from the time that we officially stopped talking to Monster to the BS that happened during her divorce to now. I don't expect any of these to be in any particular order, and as I said, I try to block a lot of this stuff out, so it may not be quite as detailed as my other stories, but I will give it my best. Also, note, we are still dealing with this woman, considering Phil is currently getting a divorce. So let's get into this. At the start, everyone in the family was still trying to play nice with this woman. However, it should be noted that even if they were playing nice, they were clearly done with her attitude. As for us, we thankfully only had one physical time we had to deal with this woman, but neither my husband nor myself acknowledged her. We continued to talk with my husband's aunt and grandmother regularly, and when my Phil was out and about, I would give him as much time as we could spare with her. Now here is where things started getting hilarious. So remember last time how I told you all about the severe panic attacks that had my husband coming home from work? I spent those next 3 days in and out of the hospital because of the trauma this entire incident had put me in, and I never once asked for their sympathies because we were just done. But here is the kicker. So, at one time, while visiting my Bill, we obviously talked it out with him about how we felt about the entire situation. We didn't think anything of it until a couple weeks later when we get a text from Phil. Apparently, Bill told them about what we talked about, and it had Monster crying all over the back porch. My husband was so mad that my Phil even suggested that we feel pity for her when she was the reason this entire argument started in the first place. Not to mention he had to sit there with me while I was in and out of the hospital for the state she put me in. After all the terrible things she had said and tried to cry fountains over, and she was trying to call for sympathy. He didn't have it. His only response was something along the lines of, "You guys didn't seem to care when you made my wife cry for days straight, and I had to stay home from work because of it." Phil tried to make up something about how he really did feel bad, but it wasn't nice of us to go around saying things like this. My husband didn't respond. And yet again, we went the longest time without speaking to this woman. We continued to try and convince Phil that he should come over to his mother's house to see the grandbaby. Now here's the kicker. A few things here. When we did have these meetings, I made sure that whether I was there or not, that husband never leaves Phil alone with the baby. I was so petrified about what this woman was lying to him about that I feared she would actually have him steal our baby, just to go against our wishes that we never wanted her in our life anymore. There were even occasions where she would try to set up play dates with my daughter and then make them at their house, despite knowing we would never bring her there. My husband only did this on 1 or 2 occasions, and she said she wouldn't be anywhere near them but was stalking them from the living room window to watch everything. My husband never entered the house and refused to let our daughter near the door for fear of allergic reactions, so they stayed on the open front porch. Another big issue was when my Phil tried to come together with my husband, he brought up many of their concerns about this entire situation. My husband had put his foot down and told Phil that he was the one making a ton of these crucial decisions and not me, despite Monster proclaiming that he was just following whatever I told him to do. I wasn't there, so I only remember the things my husband told me when he came home, but the biggest thing that irked me was Phil thinking that I was after something in return. I know that Monster and your wife are just looking for an apology that they are never going to get. I sat there apathetic at this point and trying not to break down again. My Phil thought so little of me and clearly saw nothing from our perspective. I even went on to explain to my husband that I didn't want an apology. She thinks she is right, and I don't care about that. I care about how she blatantly disregarded my daughter's needs and medical health to continue smoking her habit. Also, I was upset that when I asked her about what she wanted, she was the one who told me no to anything. But this was also the one time that my Phil learned about the comment she made about our baby. He was livid. You don't call his little girl a thing and get away with it. When he yelled at her for what she said, Monster created another sob story about I didn't mean it like that. And I only wanted to bow myself out of the equation, which my husband and I weren't having even a moment of whatever toxic tea she tried to pour. The question was not if she wanted to back out for a little bit. The question was very clearly this: if you still want to be a part of my daughter's life, then please tell me a time and place comfortable to you, not that house, that you would like to meet, and I will be glad to accommodate that for you. Her response was apparent and very blunt no. At that point, after everything she had put us through, we were officially done with her. I had given her the theoretical choice of scissors to cut her rope or the ladder to crawl back to us. She made her choice, and not a day goes by that I am not thankful for what we did. So a few months pass. Monster makes everything so tricky for everyone. If my Phil was to go anywhere, you couldn't even hint at who would be there. The Monster was so controlling that if Phil said anyone, in particular, would be there that she didn't like, He wasn't allowed to go. There were even messages that Phil showed us after the fact where he asked permission to see his mother, who lived one street away from theirs. The monster was several years younger than he was. Why did he have to ask permissions to go see anyone? Not to mention, if she did let him leave, she would text him the entire time, complaining about something or other, so he would only be there a few minutes before coming home. One such time really frustrated me because obviously it showed how childish and disrespectful she was. By this time, she was already weaving her lies to everyone, telling them that the only reason we wouldn't let her see our daughter was that she called her a thing. Not valid in the slightest, but ignoring her petty comments regularly because we washed our hands of this devil. So come to my husband's grandmother's birthday. By this time, her attitude with everyone in the family was getting old really fast. The monster was prone to telling Phil where he could go, who he could see, and control nearly every aspect of his life. Not to mention the fights she had gotten into with my aunt, making her so finished with everything. My aunt planned out and paid for a birthday party for my husband's grandmother, which monster took all the credit for as usual. So clearly, she didn't want me there but wanted my husband to come with our daughter. Two things here. My husband's grandmother herself told me that she wanted me there. She even made a comment about how she would rather me be there than Monster in a heartbeat. So going behind Monster's back, as she tried to tell everyone we were doing, she threw a hissy fit in the corner of the room. My husband and I were being polite the entire time and avoided her and the people who were clearly on her side and did not like us. We weren't starting confrontations, we simply talked with the family. Not only did the main character of this party want me there, but she made a point to invite me herself because she wanted me there so badly. However, during the party, Monster started a big scene. We made it clear to Phil from the start that if we were to make it, she was not to come near my husband or daughter once during the party. He was actually ready to knock her out at this point and didn't want to become violent because of her disgusting display of lies. So again, we avoided her and hoped she would do the same. According to other people we spoke with, she would drag people out into the hall and ask them to make me leave because I wasn't welcome. Enter my superhero aunt to save the day. Not only did my husband's grandmother tell her that she wanted me there, but when Monster pulled my husband's aunt away to ask me to leave, she told her off. Annie got so offended and told her that I had every right to be there for my grandmother and I wasn't doing anyone any harm. Angry that no one was sticking up for her at this point, she stormed over to my Phil, who we were speaking with, and I had my husband ignore her as I kept facing away from her with our baby, covering her eyes even so she wouldn't see such a despicable person. The monster angrily asks for the keys and spits out, "I was only going to ask one thing," before storming off. From there on, she kept sending ridiculous messages to my father, blowing up his phone because she forced herself to go home. I never read them personally, but you can guess how bad they were when one of the people who read them looked at my dad in shock and exclaimed how childish and selfish she was being. I repeat that my husband and I never looked at her even once during this thing and spent our time happily making conversation and being there for my husband's grandmother. No one ever asked her to leave, but she threw a hissy fit when no one would tell me to go. She even lied to people and said to them that she was kicked from her own party. We had to leave shortly after that, but it felt amazing to hear that my husband's grandmother didn't want me to go just because she ruined the party. I have never been more accepted in such a loving and happy home and made it clear how much I would do anything for them in return. Another situation that was starting to bug us was how often she would steal my Phil's phone and text on his behalf or hover over his shoulder and tell him what he should write to people. We could tell from the start that it was her because of 1. How long these texts were, and 2. How hateful and spiteful they were. This was further confirmed when my Phil would text back after leaving him alone, repeatedly apologizing for what was said because either she had taken the phone or forced him to type it. One such event was my Phil being in the hospital for stress. Her response was to text my husband and me, blaming us for being in the hospital because we were horrible people. I remind everyone that my Phil was the only source of income because she refused to get a job. All of her constant scamming was getting old and making things financially harder on them. Not to mention he worked 5 to 6 days a week for 12+ hours straight in the medical field. Only after his long shift did he have to come home to deal with this devil shouting and yelling at him for any little thing he did wrong. And then he was forced to take care of the dog she wanted and clean the mess that she made in the house all day. Not to mention she was utterly controlling when it came to anyone my Phil spoke to. Unless it was someone she knew and liked, he wasn't allowed to talk with them. I am not one to completely throw fault at someone else, and I was sure that this situation between the two households was definitely causing some severe stress, but not the entire reason he was there. So we ignored that comment quite easily, but then this crazy witch threatened us. Her exact words were, "You had better not run into me in a dark alley because you have no idea what I am capable of." So, needless to say, we completely blocked her from our contacts at that point, all except FB, because we were not prone to going to that site often. Even better was later when we told Phil what she said, and she commented about how she doesn't threaten people, she only protects the people that she loves, and proceeded to threaten us a second time. After this, we ignored her again, but her threat physically gave me night terrors, and I found it so hard to sleep. She was crazy enough that she actually tried to buy the house behind ours during the divorce so she could spy on us. It was insane. So after getting so many texts and my husband nearly blew up at this woman for her disgusting threats through his father's phone, he called. I wasn't in the room when this went down, but he told his father precisely what Monster needed to hear at this point. He was sick and tired of hearing her mouth through his phone. But her first account, after being deleted, she immediately messaged my husband on her secondary, calling him a child and needing to get brave instead of just blocking people. To which we answered by blocking her. So many things came up, but we were fading out of the image, thankfully. We heard about fights between Monster and my husband's family. She, at one point, tried to call the cops on my husband's aunt and then grew frustrated when my aunt threatened to shut off her phone. The Monster wasn't making payments on the phone, and my husband's aunt was the one paying for it. Not to mention all the threats they had received at the hands of this woman by this time, and I think we can all agree that I would have every right to shut off your phone just because you were starting drama with me every day. When my Phil would get gifts for the kids, we would check them thoroughly and throw them away if they had any mention or notice of her on them. When I said we kicked this woman out of our lives, I meant it. I even threw away marshmallows she had made and went to the store to buy actual marshmallows instead for fear that she had poisoned them. This was just how terrified she made us that she wanted to hurt us so badly. Another event was for my MIL's uncle's funeral. My Phil obviously wanted to go because the two families were still really close to one another. Obviously, my husband and I wanted to go to support and be there for the family. But when getting there, and my Phil told her the truth that he drove my husband, daughter, and myself, she hung up the phone. Talk about incredibly rude and totally disrespectful. This family was still significant to my Phil, and whether she liked it or not, it was insulting to hang up the phone and be unsupportive towards the fact that he was going through a death in the family. When he called back after the funeral, she only berated and insulted me, even going so far as to say I had no right being there just because my Phil and husband were going. I had to take a step back from this comment, like I wasn't there because my husband was going. This was one of the very few times that I asked my husband to go because I wanted to be there for my MIL sister and their family. It had nothing to do with my husband at all, and the fact that she tried to make me sound like such a sexual deviant that I would try to make this about making moves on my Phil and husband at a funeral. Even worse still was after insulting me and hanging up on him a second time, she called back crying and boohooing that she was sorry for wounding me, and then went right back to insulting me again like I wasn't in the car, knowing she could hear me. One of the biggest punches was actually from after she started losing her grip on my Phil. She wanted them to have the same lawyer during the divorce, claiming that she was committing fraud yet again and only getting this divorce to rip off the government and get SSI checks. My Phil, at this point, had been so done with her and was okay with the idea of divorce. But he wanted his own lawyer. So one time, he told her that he would be talking with his lawyer at the end of his shift. This deranged woman texted his phone during work over 130 times, and called him over 50. When he refused to answer her, she called up his workplace, claiming it was an emergency. Phil's boss pulled him into the office and had to talk with him about what she did, and he was so embarrassed. Well, after this, she tried to get my husband to talk with Phil without me there, so obviously myself, my husband, aunt, and Phil went to the place specified, where she called him and tried to harass and even threatened him again. My aunt is also very religious, but it was hilarious seeing her flip the phone off repeatedly. But the thing I couldn't stand was the comment she made. She tried to claim that my husband and my kids weren't biologically his. Where did this ridiculous notion come from? Well, a bit of backstory, my brother is horrible with women, and on occasion has gotten caught doing things he shouldn't be doing, making it quite an exciting tale. However, Monster stalked him and his firefighter friends, then told everyone that I was the one sleeping around. I have only ever been with my husband, for the record, and it was a major part of the sleeping arrangement, as I was not having sex until after marriage. Or at the very least until he proved he was willing to keep me, so he put a ring on it and we got engaged after almost 2 years of knowing each other. My 2 daughters to this day look identical to him, and he couldn't deny them if he tried. I am confident the last one will have qualities as well, considering how much they look alike. When she commented that she wanted me to take a paternity test to really show who the father was, I even told my Phil I was perfectly fine with that and only had one stipulation. No one else but her was even suggesting this audacity, and I made it clear that if Monster was so sure these kids didn't belong to him, she would have to pay for the tests herself and stop mooching money off of people. put her money where her fat mouth was. We obviously hear nothing further about this. My husband was utterly disgusted. Not only was it a slap to the face of him, but his entire side of the family. To claim such ridiculous things about us, trying to make us out like we were living some strange TLC live action show. My husband and I were happy, and she was just jealous that her relationship was not working out from day one. Now, if you saw my previous post with the summary, you know that she lied to everyone about everything. She kept playing it off as the victim and even went so far as to tell one of her now ex-friends that my Phil was cheating with his ex-wife. Said person had no idea she was referring to a dead woman from about 4+ years ago. If that wasn't bad enough, she was also lying about my Phil's family all being part of some strange sex thing. My husband's aunt, grandmother, and any female who came in contact with my Phil were all attracted to him. She spread this lie like butter all over social media. But my favorite one was now that my Phil wasn't listening to her, she was pulling the abuse card. I hope the courts come to see a few things like we have. 1. She was the one convicted of abuse against her husband and children in a previous relationship. 2. My Phil was in a relationship for about 30 years with my MIL, who was half his size and weight before this giant whale, and she never once had any signs of abuse. 3. Funny how all over social media, she never once claimed anything of abuse until after my Phil started to disobey what she was telling him to do. So here is where things kicked the fan hard. She was beginning to run with the abuse card a lot lately despite all the evidence proving that she would keep him from his family, friends, and closest relationships, proving that she was the one emotionally abusing him, not the other way around. It was even suspicious when my Phil fell down the stairs and through a glass table, so the medics there asked him if she pushed him. The best part, she claimed he laid hands on her and put bruises on her, but remember what I said about my Bill seeing the crap she would do in that house. He was a personal witness to her beating herself into counters and walls all the time to give herself bruises. Now by this time, Phil was genuinely about to lose the house. They tried letting people rent out the rooms and tried more scam deals, but nothing could save them from her incredulous spending habits. So to put this to rest, they decided that Bill would buy the house out from under them and Phil would live with him while she lived in another place that she wanted. Hence what I mentioned before about her almost buying the house behind ours. Even more ridiculous was my Phil couldn't keep affording the weed she so desperately craved, she began having huge fits where she would lay her hands on him and steal his things, then try to claim against it. I had told my Phil a week before this point to get her out of that house ASAP because her next move was to make a fake claim to the police and have him arrested. Our worst fears were realized late one night. My husband's aunt calls my phone. It is past 10, and she is beyond herself. She is so upset. The monster had called the police and claimed domestic violence against my Phil. My husband was so livid, I had to keep him in the house before he did something that would put him in jail himself and make him stay there. So we talked it out, and I told him that this would all be okay as long as we kept our faith. We prayed, and the following day, Phil was out, but not without some severe trauma. She took over his house, wouldn't let him back inside, and he could do nothing about it. The police couldn't help him, all because she flipped her switch for the millionth time. So the issue was this: during the divorce, Phil and Monster were supposed to be separated at all times, as in living separately, not just in separate rooms. According to her therapist, Monster claimed that Phil had to feed her and bring her medication, which we found out later was all lies. She did it to keep him coming around. But Phil slept upstairs and came home, only to sleep it off in his room with the door locked. At one point, she even tried to drill out the lock, like she was a psychopath. But my Phil was too lovely and told us she would never do anything. When she had him arrested, she broke into his room again and sat on the floor. Phil told her time and time again to leave his room. She refused and kept trying to convince my Phil that he needed to call my Bill and tell him not to buy the house. My Phil refused and continued to demand her to leave. So her response was to get up and take his phone for the 3rd time that day without his permission and try to call Bill. My Phil was done with her crap at this point. He grabbed her wrist long enough to take back what belonged to him and told her one last time to leave him alone. But the die was cast. He took hold of her wrist, even for a second, so she called the police. I can still remember this grown man crying like a baby to all of us. He was so scared he would lose his job, hobbies that involved school, and everything he held dear. She ruined his life from there. He was lost, with nowhere to go, so we prayed. I would also like to remind everyone that for a woman so heavily claiming abuse, my Phil refused to talk to her and message her, even going as far as blocking her phone number. From the moment he left court from the jail to this day, she harasses him through email, text, calls, you name it. She even called my husband's grandmother's home phone and left a threatening voicemail for the entire family. At one point in time, she even emailed my Phil saying that he needed to ditch his family and come see her because she was sexually longing and required him to fulfill her needs. But just like she had done to him, he was no longer talking to her, and the longer it went on, the crazier she got. Monster even tried to do stupid things to jeopardize her life and get my Phil to come to her. One such item was she needed a sharp object to cut something painful off of her skin, and when he refused to answer her, she found something to do it instead and claimed that days later she was getting sepsis. For those of you not sure what that is, life-threatening infections can happen when you allow bacteria to enter the bloodstream. Basically, she had given herself this disease to force a reaction out of my Phil, then continued to claim that he was abusing her by not coming to take care of her. She did this a lot too. After putting him in jail, she would email or text him, telling him that he was so abusive towards her because he wouldn't go out and buy her food, and they didn't have any at the house. My favorite being the lie she made up when the utilities would start getting shut off. She claimed that Phil was doing it on purpose to abuse her. My Phil had no money because of her. He couldn't pay anything if he tried. From my perspective, I see no reason to pay for utilities in a house that you weren't staying in. She tried everything she could to get rid of him in that house, and now she couldn't afford to keep it. So she was making him out to be the villain in her story. She would even post terrible lies that my Phil was preventing her from buying her new house. Note, she only didn't get her money because they had agreed that the money to buy the house would come from her portion of the profits made when selling the house she was sitting in to my Bill, which she refused to do. She even tried to post how terrible a person my Phil was, all because he was mad that I put him in jail. Slight poll here. How many of you would be peaky keen on your spouse if they put you in jail, whether you actually deserved it or not? Didn't think so. So all these lies and crap started, and she continued to make up claims even after my brother bought the house, which we have proven time and time again she was lying about. However, this is where the story comes full circle and the thing that made me despise this woman more than anything in the world. I told you all in the very beginning how I was there to witness the downfall of my Phil. I don't care if you have ever seen the most significant heartbreak in your life. This man was 100 times that. I watched him hit the floor and emotionally drown. I watched the guilt sweep everything he knew under the rug and rip him away from reality in seconds. This was a man who married his best friend. They grew old together and spent nearly every waking day together. I don't think my Phil can recall a single moment in his life that made him happiest than with my MIL in it. In the quietest of times and the darkest of days, you can see how hard it hit him. The monster was never there. She couldn't see the emotional damage, the pain, the suffering this man endured, having to move on with his life without his wife there to share it with. She took all these emotions that he tried to pour out to her for support or guidance, and did the one thing that I will never forgive her for, ever. We were sitting in the living room as he read one of her many emails through to the very end. She had even sent a copy of this over to her lawyer. The biggest lie that ever made me want to punch a chick in the throat a million times. It was when she falsely claimed that my Phil killed my MIL. She explained that he left her there to die, knowing she was gone. She wasn't there. She did not see the shock and disbelief on this man's face. She had no right to ever bring her name into this and savagely taint her. My MIL was a fantastic person, and even writing this has me in absolute tears. My Phil had no idea that she was gone. No man, no matter how talented at acting, they could never show that kind of pain. Not to mention the reaction that he had reading that email. He broke into tears, started to panic and flail, remembering the torture he went through. Had all of us terrified that we were going to lose him too. You can't fake pain like that. I will forever hate this woman with every fiber of my being. The last words I will ever say to her is, I pray the devil is kind when welcoming you back.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't watched all 6 parts of this series, I suggest you do so to get an idea of how all this situation developed. And if you like the series, please subscribe to the channel, and it would be a privilege to have you as a subscriber. Thank you.